So listen, I'd like to thank you again and welcome Stella, who is going to now give us her presentation. Stella O'Malley, delighted to welcome you to the Women's Lobby.
Hi there, thanks a million. Thank you, Ruth, that was fascinating. Yeah, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm based in Offaly, and I'm going to talk about gender dysphoria in girls, centred really on Ireland. I had my own intense experience with gender when I was a kid, very young, from around about the age of 3 till about 10. I wanted to be a boy and I was very intense about it, but I grew out of it primarily because I was raised in a different era and it was ignored. And I moved on and I had my life and I ended up becoming a psychotherapist in my 30s. And I wrote an article, because I often write articles about mental health and stuff. I wrote an article because I noticed the kind of transgender kind of phenomenon was kind of getting bigger and seemed to be going to places where it didn't quite make sense that it should be going. And I just gave my tuppence worth about where is the representation of all the kids that were me. And I came from a very kind of uneducated point at that point because I didn't know my stats, I didn't know my research, but I did know my experience. And it turns out that 80% of kids who were left without therapeutic intervention will grow out of gender dysphoria, just like I did. However, these days, an awful lot of children are getting interventions. And those interventions means that number shoots from 80% down to 5%. So if you get medical intervention for your gender dysphoria, you will be very, very likely to go on to cross sex hormones as an adult. And after I wrote the article, I got a bit of pushback, but in the end, I got asked to do a film called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, which was very good title, little did I know, because the most shocking thing about 2018 when I did that film wasn't about the gender, which was shocking in its way, but the silencing of debate and the silencing of people who just wanted to ask, well, what's the story if there's girls like Stella? There's been, for thousands of years, there's been tomboys, there's been girls who very vehemently, even in literature, if you look at Jo March and in Little Women and you look at George and Famous Five and many, 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 many other references, even my own ancestor, Grace O'Malley in the 16th century, very seriously wanted to be boys, that it's not an unusual phenomenon and yet it's suddenly been made something very serious and it's putting an awful lot of kind of narrative and politicization has been put on it. And so I got very immersed in the whole gender situation ever since 2018. And like I say, the silencing of debate really shocked me in 2018. We found like Ollie Lambert was the director, and he found that he'd done war films for 30 years, but never, he'd been in Iraq and Israel, Palestine, never had he seen such hostility towards a seeking of information than he did with our film, which was about trans kids. It just seems kind of surreal. And so since then, I've become very involved in working with gender questioning adolescents, working with parents who have gender questioning children, and doing various different things around it. And I've really got to know who especially these girls are, because it's quite notable that up until maybe 5-10 years ago, there was real emphasis on kind of middle-aged men who wanted to transition. And then it's flipped. And so it's gone from being 75% male to being 70% female who want to transition. And the numbers are startling. Like in Ireland alone, in case people think this isn't an Irish issue, in Ireland alone in the last 10 years, there's been a 2,100% rise in children wanting to transition. And within that 2,100% rise, 5,337% of them are girls. So the girls are really, really being impacted. And when you start analysing it, and when you work with these girls, you start really realising why they want to transition. And it's a combination of factors, but more than anything else, it feels like there's a kind of roles are put upon these girls at an early age, and they're put on more intensely and more narrowly than ever before. It's like almost, we're in a kind of restricted Victorian age. It's not Victorian values that we're putting on them, but it's a very restricted role that we're putting on them. And so a lot of girls, they hit first year, which is around about 12, 13, and they're sexualized from the moment they get into first year. I remember one kid telling me, like, her first day in first year, there was an assembly for the whole school, And the boys from third year, 2 years older, felt her arse and spent the whole time of her first, 20 minutes in school, in her big school. She was mortified. They were laughing. She didn't know where she was going. Like, for what, you're starting off your new school, big school, trying to be cool, trying to be sophisticated, trying to act like you're a big girl, because you are. You're 12 or 13. And the message is these days, and that's a sexual role to be. And I've heard of other girls, like, just because they were twins, they were given this poor name. Why? Because there were two girls who were twins with blonde hair in first year, and no other than that. And suddenly there was like writing on the toilet walls about their poor name. You know what I mean? So there's this kind of sexualization on children that is really impacting them. Some of the girls go towards the sexualization, understandably. Some of the girls shy away from it. What I've really noticed about the kids where gender dysphoria hits them is they're quirky, they're creative, they're not very sporty, they haven't really got their tribe, they're often very intelligent, they're a real type. And it's, again and again and again, you're going to see these types. Very arty, very often. Huge numbers have comorbidities, with autism is a big one, ADHD, and even kind of unusual conditions like PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, or whatever it's called. But the point is that they have other issues going on, and that's impacting them, making them feel unusual, and they're kind of looking for their tribe in a very sexualized world. An awful lot of the boys are very poor and saturated, and listening to Ruth, I could really see how those boys would end up being very much commodifying sex because they're so poor and saturated. And the girls are also poor and saturated. They're watching porn more than ever before, and they're being told that there's a certain way to be. I remember I gave a talk just before the lockdown, and it was in a girls' school, and it was a whole year of kids. It was about 160 kids, and I realized every single girl there had long hair. There wasn't one girl who had short hair in the year. Why? Because it's very much a set role for girls to be, and some of them don't really want it. As Sasha Ayad said, she's a great therapist based in America, and we do the Gender A Wider Lens podcast. She said often girls with gender dysphoria say, effectively, I don't feel pretty enough to be a girl. And that's the emphasis these days on girls. And it's an awful lot of pressure, more so than it was in other generations, where if you're not pretty, who are you? Where are you? The emphasis on looks is really quite intense and oppressive to these girls. And so when they say, I don't think I'm pretty enough to be a girl, they're looking for their tribe, they're looking around, and they go online and they find their tribe, and they realize, I'm not girl enough to be a girl, I'll be a boy. Because there's very little room to be gender non-conforming and not put a label on yourself. And I really think it needs to be noted that whenever I meet girls that I think might be budding lesbians, or, they haven't quite found their sexuality, they're the girls who are most vulnerable. If you've found your sexuality in a way you can follow it and you're all right, but if you're 13 and it hasn't budded, it just hasn't started, there is no room for you. There is no place for you, because people are asking you, do you fancy him? Do you fancy her? Where are you? Are you lesbian? Are you hetero? And they don't know what they are. And as a result, they kind of jump into something. I do think one thing that I've really noticed, and I know a lot of the listeners here will understand it and recognize it, is that when I meet a kid who's distressed and doesn't know their place, I might often try and find them a role model in I don't care where from, acting, sport, whatever, somebody that they'll identify with. And if the kid is a budding butch lesbian, there is no role. If there's a lesbian and they're just, I don't know, whatever, an ordinary lesbian, there is no role. I don't have the references points. And I know some of you will suddenly jump on with some people, but they're not very famous and they're not very visual, because I don't see enough of them. And I can't reference to my natural gender questioning, gender non-conforming 13, 14-year-old, oh, but what about whoever, because they aren't visible. And it's the biggest issue, I would say, in these girls' lives, is they don't have somebody to refer to. And they don't have somebody that they can look upon and say, yeah, that's a place I could go. That's where I fit in society. And I think as a result, they get lost. And they often seem to, it's really noticeable with the kids who are obsessed with their gender, who agonize about their gender, who agonize about what are they? Are they trans, or are they femboys, or are they agender or free gender. They're probably not free gender, but they're one of the various billion names out there that they are. And they're in genuine distress, and it's not something to be dismissed, because their anxiety is high and their tension is high, and yet they don't know anything about their sexuality. They're very disconnected from their body. They're very disconnected from who they fancy. They're not connected with any sort of kind of rising kind of, hormones of I want to be stimulated, or I want to masturbate, or I want to be with them. They are not getting it. They are completely disconnected. They're completely in their mind, and it's rattling around their head. It's like the gender identity has suppressed their sexuality. And it's a real issue. And I don't know how we need to handle teenage sexuality, but I do know that we need to start confronting it, because at the moment we're just ignoring it, and I don't think it's working. I don't think it's helping anybody. And I think it's making people, especially young girls, feel that there's no place for them. If they're not hypersexualized, they need to completely suppress their sexuality. And we need to kind of have some sort of halfway house where a budding sexuality is an okay place to be. And we haven't got it yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella. Very interesting, and a lot of food for thought, and it really points out to how this is really a social issue that we really need to start addressing on a broader level. So thank you again for that.